Ladies and gentlemen, let me say how glad I am to be here, and glad also to see you here, and especially glad that we're all here in Birmingham, or Brum as we call it, which some would say, and I would be one of them, is where it all started. I know that Oxford tends to hog the credit, but that is what Oxford always does. But I'm not going to talk about the start of it all this time. I'm going to talk about Tolkien's legacy, which is pretty considerable, actually. Well, I had a good idea about this some years ago, but like quite a lot of my good ideas, it didn't come to anything. And the good idea, well, perhaps I should just say that I would like to revive it, and maybe with your advice and assistance, I will revive it. And I've got a little notebook in my pocket to write all the suggestions down. What I'd like to do is to create a kind of taxonomy of modern fantasy, and I'll explain what I mean by that in a few minutes. Meanwhile, I'd like to begin by quoting the slogan of the German Tolkien Society, or Deutsche Tolkien Gesellschaft, and it's this: Ohne Tolkien, keine Fantasy. Without Tolkien, no fantasy. It's a good slogan. And if Tobias were here, which he doesn't seem to be, and he had brought me a t-shirt with it on, which I think he will, I would be proud to wear it. But it's not 100% true. There was fantasy before Tolkien, and there was fantasy independent of Tolkien. And if you don't believe me, I cannot do other than recommend you take a look at Doug Anderson's collection, Tales Before Tolkien. So I asked myself then, what exactly is it that Tolkien did? And I think that what he did was reconcile two things, or two traditions, which till then had seemed completely incompatible. There was ambitious literary fantasy, mostly British, and there was popular mass market fantasy, mostly American. What Tolkien did was make literary fantasy mass market, or if you prefer, he made mass market fantasy ambitious and literary. Either way. Let me just run over the bit about ambitious literary fantasy, adding one thought which is burned into my brain as a result of an ancient trauma. Some things you don't get over. British fantasy in the 1950s and before was ambitious, and it was literary. And I'd add one other adjective: it was expensive. Here's an example by a fantasy author who made quite an impact on me before I ever read Tolkien, and he's now, as far as I know, completely forgotten. It was a guy called Richard Garnet. This is his collection, The Twilight of the Gods. I'm holding it up so you can see it. It's big, it's heavy, it's hardback. It has gilt embossing on the front, right? And published by the Bodley Head in Oxford, very upscale. And it's got a foreword by T.E. Lawrence. That's Lawrence of Arabia Lawrence. Well, you can see, this is very upper class stuff. This is a book suitable for a gentleman's library. And of course, not the kind of book, in other words, that you find in a student's bedsit. Well, in Garnet, I should say, like M.R. James, the great author of ghost stories, was actually a very learned man from the British upper class. He was keeper of printed books at the British Museum, no less. Many, many literary connections, right through to the Bloomsbury Group. Okay, now here's my first edition of the Fellowship of the Ring. Hardback. If I had all three volumes here, it would be even heavier than Garnet. Gold stamp on the front, though I admit that is a stamp from King Edward's School. I'll explain that in a moment. And of course, along with what I'm saying is, along with all the other things it was like Garnet, it was expensive. It was too expensive for me when it came out, I can tell you, and I shall now rub that point in. How much did it cost in the late 1950s when I was trying to find a copy to read? It cost a guinea. Now, many of you will not know what a guinea was, so I should explain. In our old currency, the sensible one before we went on this decimal kick, there were 12 pennies to a shilling, and there were 20 shillings to a pound. But there were 21 shillings to a guinea. If you price things at a guinea, it was a way of saying, this is upper class stuff, and we're charging you an extra 5% for it. Meanwhile, as I remember very well, I hope you're all counting the numbers here. Back in the late 1950s in Birmingham, when I was actually just starting my first underpaid skivvy job, I used to pop into the Country Girl in Selly Oak for a pint of Mitchell's and Butler's mild beer. And it cost me, as I well remember, 1 shilling and 2pence. That's, if you've been following me, 14 old pence. And if you've been following my arithmetic further, you'll recall that a guinea, the price of 1 volume of Lord of the Rings, was 252 old pence. A moment's thought will tell us, I hope, that the 1 volume of Lord of the Rings was the same price as 18 pints of beer. Now, in the interest of scientific research, I would like to pop into the Country Girl in Selly Oak, I should say, and just check what the price of mild beer is, but I didn't have time. But I can tell you, it would be £4 at least. So if you use the patent Tom Shippey beer-based inflation rate which is much more accurate than anything you get from a bloody economist. The equivalent price for 1 volume of Lord of the Rings nowadays would be £72. For all 3 volumes, £216. Which, as you could well understand, as a teenager, back in the late 1950s, I had not got. So how did I get hold of Lord of the Rings? Well, this is the ancient trauma burned into my brain, I can tell you. Because the fact was that some black-hearted fiend had stolen volume 2 from the local library. So week after week I'd go in and I'd see the missing volume and I'd finger the first volume and I'd think, should I start reading it? But then I'll get to the end and I won't know what happens next. So I'd put it back again. This went on for weeks, I can assure you. So how did I ever get to read Lord of the Rings? Well, this is it. I had to win a book prize. And this is my book prize from King Edward's School. And I see it is the B Block Form Prize, Modern Language Division. Yes, they did get my name right. 1959. And, well, I'm on the subject. I think that was the year when Tolkien's classmate came to give the prizes at Speech Day. And this was a very strange occasion because my dad put his suit on a Saturday to come and watch. But he wasn't coming to see me. He was coming to see Tolkien's classmate and immediate contemporary. And that was Field Marshal Sir William Slim, Viscount Slim of Burma, Knight of the Garter, Commander of the Imperial General Staff, Governor General of Australia. Tolkien's exact classmate, and a point which people have not noticed, another Catholic. Not only was he at King Edward's with Tolkien, he went to the same Catholic primary school. They'd known each other from the age of 8. Well, the King Edward School song, and if you keep buying me rum and cokes, I'll sing it for you. Actually says at one point, these have plucked the bays of battle. Slim, best general since Wellington. Those have won the scholar's crown. Tolkien, beat that! As I often say when I'm addressing the audience, a friendly audience, I say, look at us, and what has bloody Eton produced in this time? Politicians! And the only audience don't just clap, they bang their tankards on the table and shout. So I think we made at that point there. Well, eventually, as I say, I won the prize, and I managed to scrape the money together for the other 2 volumes, but basically it's not for me, own a Tolkien kind of fantasy, it was own a prize kind Tolkien. literary, ambitious, expensive. Meanwhile, of course, there was also mass market fantasy, produced by people like Robert E. Howard, the inventor of Conan the Conqueror, Conan the Barbarian, I should have said, and Jack Vance. Nothing to do with Tolkien, and published in the old pulp fiction magazines like Weird Tales. They sold very widely, and the magazine cost only 25 cents, or in England, 1 and threepence. Not 1 and twopence, 1 and threepence. But even I could find the extra penny at that stage. But these had no prestige at all. The ambitious British tradition had no connection with the mass market American tradition. But then, there was the Pirate Ace edition of Tolkien. And then, there was the authorized Valentine paperback. And as we all know, Tolkien at that point took off. Not only did he make himself mass market, he made the whole fantasy genre mass market. Back in the 1960s, every publisher was baying for a new Tolkien. And there were plenty of people ready to supply one. 2 anecdotes here. I was talking years ago to an American publisher with whom I was on good terms, so he'd be honest with me, which you don't often get with publishers. And I asked him, Dave, why the hell did you publish? And I mentioned a particularly crap Tolkien imitation, which I'm not going to mention. I said, you must have known it was a straight rip-off, character for character, scene for scene. We knew all right, he replied. We didn't publish it because we thought it was good. We published it because we knew we could sell it. Well, people often say to me, oh, Tom, you are so cynical. Am I cynical enough? Well, another anecdote. This time, many years later, I was talking to a British publisher, and I asked him for some reason, what he'd like someone to write for him. Historical novel? Science fiction? Fantasy? And he replied, very flatly, he said, fantasy. These days, only fantasy is mass market. Everything else is just genre fiction. And he thought for a bit, and he added, that includes mainstream. So the Booker Prize doesn't matter anymore. The only people who care about that are the literary lovies down in London. Whoever wins the Booker Prize won't sell enough copies to make any difference. Fantasy has swept them all aside because Tolkien mated ambitious with mass market. One other anecdote, and this is going to be a bit of an interactive one, you're going to have to reply to this. After I published Tolkien, Author of the Century, to the fury of my literary critic colleagues, every time I say literary critic colleagues, you notice I'm being sarcastic. Anyway, I was asked to debate Author of the Century with a very distinguished literary critic, but the coward refused to come to the telephone. And I heard him shouting at the interviewer, Author of the Century? Has the fella never heard of Proust? Okay, now, in this hall, hands up everyone who's read À la recherche du temps perdu.
Only graphic novel.
Well, what's that?
Only the graphic novel.
I thought I'd get a 0 score there. Next example. Hands up anyone who's read a single page of À la recherche du temps perdu. I'm surprised. Well, I still think that's a clear decision, actually. What about my good idea, which was to establish a taxonomy of modern fantasy? This is a job beyond any single person. There's just too much of it. I'm told that there are 700 works of fantasy published every year in English, all aiming at the mass market. Now, I am the reviewer of fantasy and science fiction for the Wall Street Journal, the most influential paper in, I think, the world. So I get sent up an awful lot of them. In fact, the day before I came away, the postman turned up and he gave me 8 books a day. Well, not long ago, in fact, I rang up my editor at the Wall Street Journal and whined, Tim, I've just piled up all the heroic fantasies I've got for the coming month on my desk, and I've measured them. And the pile is 2 feet high, and they're all 800 pages. got to read them all. And I added, and they've all got the same kind of title. I've got Ruin of Queens, and Sisters of Fire, and Walls of Stone, and Blood of 10 Kings. Can't they think of another kind of title? Anyway, calm down, he said, just pick one. He said, I've forgotten what it was. You know what's caused that, of course? It's Mr. Martin and the HBO series. But would Martin be there at all if the pattern hadn't been set by Tolkien? No, he bloody wouldn't. In fact, I'm glad owner Tolkien, kind Martin. And by the way, he knows that. He's very respectful. He's always very respectful of Tolkien. Nevertheless, my good idea, which never came off, was to produce a collective of post-Tolkien writers of what we might as well call Tolkienian fantasy. We would try to indicate what has become hegemonic within the tradition and what is original. And we try to trace the threads of the Tolkien legacy. Because after all, what I'm telling you, and you know it already, this is a major literary phenomenon. Maybe the most important literary phenomenon of the 20th/21st century. It deserves a history and a cultural explanation. Somebody should be writing PhDs about it. And they're all writing them on Proust. Actually, I know that they're writing PhDs about him. She's quite good, so I won't say anything disrespectful about her. Well, as I say, my literary critic colleagues wouldn't have anything to do with it. They're all too busy reading Proust and James Joyce, but actually they're pretending to. Some years ago, I was beaten and kicked until I agreed to give a lecture on Ulysses, James Joyce's Ulysses, and I got the new, revised, corrected edition. And I read through the philological chapter, The Oxen of the Sun, and I noticed it was full of obvious typos. So, I made a list, and I sent it to James Joyce Quarterly, the academic journal studying Joyce, and I waited for the letter of acceptance and the letter of grateful thanks, and it didn't come. Because what upset them was I just proved no one had ever read the chapter. Hands up everyone who's read James Joyce's Ulysses. And you didn't notice the typos? Well, so much for that. Well, my idea of the taxonomy of modern fantasy broke down on two problems. And you can help me with this. First, I need a list of the 20 top authors. Because I haven't read them all. There's too many for me to get my head round. And I also need a list of 20 guys who can write a well-informed essay on each of them. And as I say, any help you can give me on either list would be much appreciated. Well now, who would I put on the list? And most important question, what is distinctive about each of them? Well, I've only got time for three. And they are Stephen Donaldson, Michael Swanwick, and George Martin. All admirable, all distinctive, all posing questions about the nature and purpose of fantasy and about their relationship to Tolkien. Well now, where are we going? Let's see if this works. Yeah, there we go. First one, Stephen R. Donaldson. He was born in 1947. He began to publish his Chronicles of Thomas Covenant in 1977. It's now up to 10 volumes. The last one being The Last Dark in 2013. And there is a study of him by Bill Senior, Stephen R. Donaldson's Chronicles of Thomas Covenant, Variations on the Fantasy Tradition. I should say that Stephen Donaldson is a friend of mine, as is Bill Senior. Indeed, we are all members of a secret society. Now, unfortunately, wound up, which I shan't tell you about because it's secret. That means Stephen isn't going to tell me any fibs, no matter what he says to my literary critic colleagues. What's his relationship to Tolkien? Now, Stephen swears blind, and as I say, I believe him, that he never had any imitation any intention of imitating Tolkien, and for reasons aforesaid, I believe it. However, at the start of the Chronicles, it did look as if he was imitating Tolkien. And just to run through a few similarities, what I haven't done is write in the Tolkienian parallel. But I guess you can figure that out for yourself. That's right. Just running through a few of those similarities. So he says he wasn't imitating Tolkien, but, well, how to reconcile this contradiction? Well, briefly, what I think, and this applies not only to Stephen, but to other writers too, if you read Tolkien in early life, it doesn't leave you. You may forget it up here, but you don't forget it down here. So similarities may well be unconscious. But in any case, there are very marked differences between Tolkien and Donaldson. Just to be awkward, I'll point to one more similarity. It struck me years ago, this is one of my kind of 3 good ideas I've had in my life. It struck me years ago that many of the most important 20th century writers of fantasy were traumatized authors. Traumatized authors. They were often guys who'd been shot, or been shot at very, very seriously. I won't go through my list, but note especially Kurt Vonnegut, author of Slaughterhouse-5, who was in Dresden the night the British firebombed it. Yeah, he said he couldn't understand what the hell was going on. He was only 17, he was a POW, he didn't know where he was, he didn't speak a word of German. They put him down in the abattoir, the cellar of the abattoir, Slaughterhouse-5, Schlachthof, and when he came up, everybody was dead. He said he couldn't make any sense of it. And he wrote his fantasy, of course, in order to make sense of it. Okay, traumatized authors. But there's more kinds of trauma than being shot. And here I think Donaldson comes in again. Like me, but like very, very few Americans, he spent his childhood in India. And in fact, he spent it in a leprosarium, a home for lepers, run by his parents. I'm not saying this is exactly traumatic, but it does mean that Stephen has personal knowledge of levels of suffering which are most un-American. So many of the derivative fantasies that they make me read are written by people with, let me say it very politely, very limited social experience outside safe, cozy, white flight suburbs. Just to give one example, and again, no names mentioned, I was reading one of these, which is the usual. You know, a medieval world, young woman discovers she's a princess in a kingdom threatened by invasion from dark forces. So how does she set about dealing with it? She sets up a nationwide system of public libraries. So everyone is converted to a life of virtue. Yeah, that should do it. Well, Donaldson is different. To start with, his hero is a leper himself. Tolkien's hobbits were one bold switch on the traditional Conan the Barbarian type hero, you know, big and butch and all that stuff. But Donaldson is another. Because actually, Thomas Covenant is a leper himself. And being a leper means not only that he cannot solve matters by physical confrontation, he also has to be constantly careful. Those lost nerve endings, they don't grow back. Cuts, burns, even structural damage may go unnoticed. For lepers, self-monitoring becomes a way of life. Not an ideal start for heroic action. Covenant, moreover, carries from the start a burden of guilt, quite alien to hobbits, in forms which are readily recognizable in our own real world. In some fantasies, characters escape from their griefs into a world which presents more negotiable challenges. But as his series has progressed, Covenant has taken more and more of his relationship issues with him into his other world, the land. There's his ex-wife Joan, consumed with anger and desire for revenge, perhaps as a result of her own guilt, because she abandoned a sick husband when he became a leper. There's his new partner, Lyndon, who is also a kind of leper, not physically but mentally. Leprosy makes you numb, untouchable, unaffected, and Lyndon, terribly traumatized in youth, has cut herself off emotionally. Very briefly then, the fantasy world is a kind of mirror of Covenant's remarkably dysfunctional family back in the real world. A sick land which cannot heal itself, that's Covenant. The abused and injured females in the land, they're Joan and Lyndon. And here's another thing. One of the few books that have studied fantasy in general is Farah Mendelssohn's Rhetorics of Fantasy. And she has suggested that there are 4 basic types of fantasy. That didn't work, did it? I don't know what's going on here. I'll tell you what. I'll just tell you what they are. There we are. You got it. Yep. Okay. There we are. Good. Well, you see what they are. I won't read all that out for you. The first, the portal quest. That's quite easy, isn't it? Little girl goes through wardrobe. Bang! She's in Narnia. That's one kind of fantasy. The second is fairly easy. Well, actually put Terry Pratchett up, but actually, The Lord of the Rings. You're in the fantasy world, and you're centered already on fantasy characters. The third, the intrusive fantasy, is where something from the other world comes through from outside, or some old dark force is revived, as in Susan Cooper's The Dark is Rising. That's what the title says, isn't it? And the fourth, liminal fantasy, is one you can't fit in, of course. But I think The Hobbit is a good example. The Hobbit looks like immersive fantasy. We start off in the Shire, and that's that. We're there already. But actually, the fact is, as you know, that Bilbo is completely unfamiliar with the world outside the Shire. He's just like us. He doesn't understand about trolls. When the dwarves say to him, "Hoot twice like a barn owl and once like a screech owl," he doesn't know how to do it. He's used to having his meat dressed to him, supplied by the butcher. He's just like us. So his journey to the Lonely Mountain, it's a portal quest fantasy for him. It starts off immersive, but it turns into a kind of portal. And we go along with it, as you do in portal quest fantasies. Now, going back to Steve Donaldson, his chronicles look like portal fantasy. The hero just finds himself in this strange world, the land. It's quite unfamiliar to him, and it has rules and conditions he doesn't understand. But he keeps moving backwards and forwards. And the connection between his real world problems and his fantasy world problems keeps being made clearer and clearer. So there's one thing you can be quite sure of. This is not escapist. He's not escaping, because he has to keep going back. And like Tolkien, Donaldson is confronting what he sees as the vital issues of our time and playing them out in fantasy, just like Vonnegut did. And again, very briefly, if the underlying base note of Tolkien's work was the traumas of the early 20th century industrial war and the corruptions of totalitarianism, then the base note of Donaldson's chronicles is pollution, toxic dumping, physical pollution, medical and psychic disease. He's saying, if you want to save the whales and the polar bears and the earth, then we need to look inside first. Because we're all lepers. We're falling to bits, but we don't notice it. Well, that's what I think about Stephen Donaldson. Let's see if I can get this. Try poking that one. Michael Swanwick now. He's not a member of the Secret Society, and I don't know him. But the series I focus on this. It's his sequence called Industrialized Fairy. And one once again, there's an article about this in Dimitra and Thomas Honeygrove's work. It's by me, actually, so I don't want to plug myself at this point. Can you think of anything less Tolkienian than industrialized fairy? I think if you even said the phrase to Tolkien, he'd have had a fit. Nevertheless, I think in one way, Swanwick is closer to Tolkien and to Tolkien's original inspiration than any other writer of fantasy. It's now known that hobbits turn up only once before Tolkien in a strange pamphlet from the 19th century which lists, and I have counted them, some 196 kinds of folklore creature, almost all of which have vanished from memory. But one of them is hobbits. You can see actually that 196 was a bit of a cheat because he says some of them twice. Corridors are down there twice, and there's quite a lot of them. But there's a lot just the same. You see hobbits are there. I forget what their number was, 114 or something like that. Well, very briefly, Swanwick uses a lot of them, and a few more as well. And I cannot believe this is an accident, because so many of them are just forgotten. Nobody knows their terms. But Swanwick has got knockers and hob thrushes. Well, I could find you hob thrush references, but he's also got shelly coats, cluricorns, spunkies, chitty faces, boggarts, hates, woodwoses, holders, Billy Bugaboo. There you are, Bugaboo or Bugaboo is up there on line 1. Billy Bugaboo is a named character, and another named character is the Called Lad. Well, I think Swanwick must have got those from the Denham Tract, which is also the place where you find hobbits. What I like about this is that Tolkien's choice of fantasy species has become kind of hegemonic. Everyone these days has elves and dwarves and trolls and even orcs, that was a Tolkien invention, as well as variants on ents and variants on halflings. But Swanwick realizes there is a wider selection available from the Goblin universe, and he used it heavily. Moreover, I'm going to try poking this again. Wrong. Ah, there we are. Going back to Farrar Mendelssohn's taxonomy of fantasy types, the Iron Dragon's Daughter looks like an immersive fantasy. It starts off with a child trapped in a dragon factory, run by elves, constantly threatened and beaten and half-starved. I read this, you know, when it came out in the magazine years ago, and I thought, blimey, this is just like boarding school. I remember all this, yes. But she is, in fact, unlike me, a changeling. She's in training to be a dragon pilot, or possibly even worse, a breeder for dragon pilots, because she can endure cold iron, which her elf owners cannot. And also, she retains connections with her early life, which is us. You know, she keeps remembering Pepsi-Cola adverts. She keeps getting snatches of phrases we know. She's kind of, well, it's a portal fantasy, yeah, as well as an immersive one, but for her, the portal goes the other way. So that's really quite an innovative thing. And the whole series becomes a kind of negotiation between fairy and reality, and the two leak into each other all the time. And it's also, in a way, a grim commentary on politics. Not 20th century politics, 21st century politics. I won't specify any further, but it's very clever, and I do recommend it. Well, Owner Tolkien kind of fantasy, yes, I think that's right. But nevertheless, Swanwick has made it new, it's original. Finally, there's the biggie, George Martin. And I've only got two things to say about him. One is, he changed his name at the age of 13. His real name is George Raymond Martin. At the age of 13, he added a name, Richard, and he became George J.R.R. Martin. Just like J.R.R. Tolkien. Surely that was deliberate. I'm suggesting that Martin, at a very early age, got the idea of matching Tolkien in some way. I won't say outdoing. I don't know what his exact ambition was, but matching Tolkien. Now, the other thing I've got to say about him, and I've got to say this isn't my idea, I got it from a guy called Brian Miller. And as soon as he said it, I thought, yeah, that's right. So I was immediately convinced by it, but you may not be. Let me put two propositions to you. Is it not the case that in Tolkien, characters are good or bad? Nothing in the middle. No shades of grey. I can see heads shaking. Ha! Why do people argue with me? I've never been able to understand. I know what you're thinking. There's Boromir. No? He's a good character who is corrupted by the ring, because that's what the ring does to all characters, whoever they are. And I might say the ring works on you by picking something good out of you and perverting it. In Boromir's case, of course, service to Gondor. Then there's Denethor. No, he's a bad character. He's a suicide. He's a son murderer. And he's not corrupted by the ring. He's corrupted by his own fear. This is disputable, and people have disputed it with me. And they are wrong. I think I proved that. Well, how about Gollum? No, he's not a character. He's two characters. He's two characters. There's Gollum, who is corrupted by the ring, and Smeagol, who is made into a murderer by the ring. Nevertheless, they are still, in a sense, two characters, because, as you know, Smeagol sometimes peeps out of Gollum and is shoved back. Okay, who's the best example of a morally ambiguous character in Tolkien? I've rejected all the ones you thought of, and I've come out with a very minor character. Lobelia Sackville Baggins. Now, you may remember, she is under strong suspicion of stealing Bilbo's silver spoons at the end of The Hobbit. And furthermore, she and all her family can't stand the Bagginses. So that makes her a bad character. But on the other hand, in the Scouring of the Shire, it is reported that she went for Saruman's gang with her umbrella, showing more spirit than most of the hobbits. And she was eventually released from the lockholes to great applause, after which she becomes popular for the first time in her life, and she bequeaths all her property to charity. So there's a character who has a change of heart. Okay, well, that's my example of a morally indeterminate character in Tolkien. But in Martin, surely the case is much clearer. It's not the case that they're all good or bad and there are no shades of grey. They're all shades of grey. Some are very dark grey, and they'll say some are very pale grey. But frankly, you wouldn't want to have a beer with any of them. There are plenty of people who are absolutely horrible, like Rhys Bowden, who hunts girls with man-eating dogs. And then there's Cersei Lannister, who blow the whole thing up in order to retain power. There's Jaime Lannister, who is incestuous and is prepared to murder a child to conceal his crime. And there's, well, you can fill them in for yourself. Is there anyone who can be called like good? This is not. Perhaps I'm pushing the wrong. Well, I'm not pushing the wrong. It'll come up. There we are. These are examples of admirable characters in J.R.R. Martin. Well, there's Sansa Stark. She feeds her husband to the dogs. Well, she was provoked. There's Arya Stark, who is a trained assassin, and she feeds his own sons to Lord Frey in a pie, which might be regarded as going a bit far. There's a Daenerys Targaryen, you know, very nice hairstyle, but a tendency to crucify people and also burn them alive. For instance, the Dothraki widows, you know, she burns the widow's house down and all the widows inside it. Perhaps you should have encouraged them to come out instead. Well, anyway, no, that's what she did. And then there's Jon Snow. Nice guy in many ways, but of course you have to remember that when it comes to it, he's quite prepared to hang a child who is well underneath the age of, you know, official responsibility. There's Tyrion Lannister, cleverest person in the show, but he does shoot his own father, and also in embarrassing circumstances, which I feel is unfilial. You should have waited and shot him later. And, okay, I won't go through them. You can see the ones I'm talking about. You notice, if you've seen the end of the TV series, the only character fit to take the Iron Throne in the end is Bran the Broken, first of his name. Why? Because he hasn't done anything in the whole series. Well, that's my point, saying there's a difference between them, a very big difference. And the question is, do you think that's deliberate? Tolkien created a world of moral certainty. And therefore Martin said to himself, I'm going to create a world of total moral uncertainty. And if so, what does that tell us about the way things have changed between 1954 and like now? Well, price of beer has gone up something shocking. I suspect that there have been more far-reaching changes in our collective psyches as well. Well, I'm not going to answer my own question. What does that tell us about the way things have changed? I'll let you come up with your own answers and tell me if you've got a good one. But I will say this about Tolkien's legacy. First, he made fantasy the dominant literary tradition of our time, both mass market and ambitious. It's true that my literary critic colleagues haven't noticed, but they're like economists and bankers, experts whose expertise is now totally discredited. Second point. Gosh, I hope this comes out. Ah, yeah, there we are. He made fantasy the dominant image of our time, and he gets everywhere. I live so deep in the countryside you couldn't find it, and it's about as close to the Shire as you can get. And I was walking past a shop window the other day and I saw this. It's a diorama. It's Middle-earth mice. Okay, there's Aylmer. See the white horse on the green field? There's Saruman the White. There, of course, is Treebeard. I rather think that is my old pal, Ugluk the Orc. I always admired Ugluk the Orc because I used to be a head of department. I can't get my literary critic colleagues to do anything. And I always admired the way that Ugluk dealt with disagreement. I like to do it so often at the staff meeting, you know. Snarl with rage, go, slash, slash! Everybody do what I say! They wouldn't let me do it, you know. Anyway, there they are, and you know, I'm sure I can identify them all, and so can everybody else. They don't need any introduction. Even in the depths of the countryside, so far away you can't find it anymore, Tolkien needs no introduction. He's got into the collective psyche all the way from the top right down to the bottom. Well, third thing, what have I said? First, he made fantasy the dominant tradition. Second, it's got through to everybody. Third, his appeal has been curiously universal. You know, back in the Vietnam era, Tolkien was, of course, very popular with the counterculture. It was a joke, wasn't it? How do you recognize a hippie? Well, he's got flared jeans with embroidery on them, he's wearing granny glasses, which he probably doesn't need, and he's holding a copy of Lord of the Rings. That was your traditional hippie. Yeah, the funny thing is, I'm not saying that all the grunts in Vietnam were reading Lord of the Rings as well, but I know a lot of them were. And actually, although he's being celebrated as a hero of the counterculture, a protester against Mordor, he was also seen by the other side as a promoter of patriotism and family values. And you know what? They were both right. Well, Tolkien then has reached both ends of the political spectrum. His legacy goes all the way from 10-volume, 8,000-page epics to Middle-earth mice in a shop window. So, how should I describe his legacy? I've been thinking about this, you know. In fact, I was up at 6 o'clock this morning scratching my head and trying to think of the punchline. Well, the only word I can find for Tolkien's legacy, literary and cultural, is incalculable. I don't know how far it stretches. I don't know how far it will stretch. Well, anyway, last comment. I wrote this book called Tolkien, Author of the Century, to the fury of my literary critic colleagues, not them all. I meant the 20th century. But I think I was wrong. I'm so humble, it really is. I think I was wrong. It's the 21st century as well. And his legacy is still ongoing, it's incalculable, but I would like to have a better go at calculating it. So if you've got any suggestions, see me anytime. Thanks very much.
Some first age elves. I think I heard some readings in the audience, but I accepted that you are right. Now, I think we're going to take some questions from the audience. We've got about 10 minutes. There should be somebody with a mic, so we're able to hear everybody. I know I'm booming a bit. We have. I saw the first hand up was Pete over here. We have a mic. We can
right with Matthew at the moment.
Right.
That's going forward.
I try shouting.
Go on then.
So one thing about Tolkien is he wrote and he rewrote and he rewrote. And I wonder if you've got a scale of how much effort these different authors that you review and the ones you talked about, how much effort do they put into the page and paragraph per word, and how would you rate them on a scale with Tolkien?
Well, of course I don't know you know, how much they wrote and rewrote, but I could ask a few of them. They might not tell me the truth, mind. I should say, actually, that from the vast amount of this stuff I've read, it is very hard to match Tolkien's style, and that is partly because his literary experience was so much wider than anybody, really. After all, Tolkien was, I think, in some areas, the most learned man in the world. You're not going to match that. And he could, it's a good point, actually. Tolkien could alter his style. He could move up and down the stylistic scale quite easily. And indeed, one of my literary critic colleagues, who's actually quite good, I have to say, was old Northrop Frye, who said that there's kind of 5 levels of literary, whatever the hell it was, myth. epic, romance, novel, irony. And he pointed out that over the last couple of thousand years, we've been steadily moving down the scale, from myth to irony. But actually Tolkien could write them all. And he did too. So we have the cosmogonic in the Silmarillion. We have, of course, the, I would say, the normal novel level, the realistic novel level with the hobbits. But you've also got an epic level and a romance level. Whether Tolkien actually does the ironic level, in which you are, as it were, the reader is looking down at the characters and regarding him or herself as superior to them, I don't think he does that.
Farmer Giles.
Huh?
Farmer Giles.
Farmer Giles.
Correct?
Farmer Giles, they say.
Oh, well, I don't look down on Farmer Giles. But yeah, I take the point. That element of comedy is perhaps is there as well. So let's say you could move up and down. Well, you don't find that, you don't match that very readily.
I think the next question is Joel.
Yeah.
His hand on still next.
You made a really interesting point about the way Tolkien deals with trauma through his books and how that is something that has been passed on to others who have been influenced by him. I think that is becoming more and more apparent nowadays. A lot of the best fantasy I've read recently has been about various kinds of trauma. I think N.K. Jemison's Broken Earth trilogy is very much about the trauma of being othered and of racism especially. How do you see? Do you think that Tolkien has popularized that particular aspect of what makes fantasy appealing? That it's a way of dealing with these traumas?
There is always a tendency for people nowadays to see the roots of an author's inspiration as something in early life, and of course Tolkien didn't like biographical criticism. He thought it was intrusive, I guess. And also, of course, you don't know. You don't know what people feel or what they suffer. But on the whole, I think, yeah, Tolkien had a very tough time in early life. But my impression of him was that he was remarkably unaffected by it. He struck me as a very genial, cheerful old gentleman. You could point to various aspects of hardship, but they were over for him by the time he was about 30 odd, I think. Though, of course, and I don't forget this, he did suffer the same trauma as I did, which was the determined attempt to destroy his professional discipline by my literary critic colleagues. Who is it? Is it Elron? I forget. Who says, "Through the ages we have fought the long defeat." Yeah, I know how you feel. I spent my professional life usually trying to keep some elements of philology on the goddamn curriculum, despite determined efforts to stop it. And so did Tolkien. And we always lost. We always lost. We were always outnumbered. And so it's a great pleasure to me to actually think that we went over the heads of the experts and appealed to the popular audience. And what pleases me even more is how badly they've taken it.
There's two authors whose relationship with Tolkien has always struck me as very interesting. One of whom being Michael Moorcock, who has always been, shall we say, extremely negative about Tolkien, and yet, if you actually read any of his fantasy, you'll just see how almost despite himself the influence is. But an author I've always found very interesting, who also very strongly influenced Martin, was Tad Williams. I don't know if you've read Tad Williams, but I feel much of the developments in modern fantasies can be directly owed to Tad Williams, as you know, through Tad Williams via Tolkien via Tad Williams. I don't know if you would agree with that or not.
Well, Tad Williams is one of the authors I don't know well. So I'd have to put him on my list of 20 and get somebody else to write one. Michael Moorcock, on the other hand, I do know rather better. Well, I think that's a case of, what should we call it, sort of filial animosity. There are quite a few authors, actually, and I know them, who will swear on a stack of Bibles that they weren't copying Tolkien, didn't know anything about Tolkien, weren't influenced by Tolkien, but you look at the evidence and you think, well, it could have fooled me. Alan Garnet wrote The Weird Stone of Garnet. Where did he get that from? I wonder. Okay. I don't like to say, I didn't say it with Stephen Donaldson. I don't say that these guys are fibbing. They may have forgotten. But I think there are cases, and I think Moorcock is one of them, where they're just not going to admit it. But of course, Moorcock did try to create a new kind of era, a bit like Donaldson. Because Elric, you know, isn't a leper, but there's something badly wrong with it, just the same. So it's a case of another victim hero, you might say. Yeah, well, these are all interesting cases, and that's why I think it would be good to have a taxonomy. You know, I'd actually like to have a kind of diagram which spread them all out in different ways. You'd never get it to convince everybody. But I'd be quite happy if it convinced me.
Before we get to that, let's go to Lynn then.
Yeah, sure.
Just wonder how important you think the times they lived in are important. I think one of the most remarkable things about Tolkien was he was an Edwardian, he was a late Victorian.
Yeah.
And yet we love his, yes, there's the media representations of Tolkien that appeal to the modern audience.
Yeah.
But they're also coming back to the literature and developing an interest in philology through the literature.
Yeah.
So modern writers, I sometimes wonder, in 100 years, will we still be being read and loved in the same way Tolkien is now?
You know, even the wise cannot see all ends. But I would think so. My own feeling is that once we get rid of the sort of prejudices of the later 20th century, he will become quite clear. Indeed, you know, I said once, I think, that Tolkien was the English Grimm, and I meant Jacob Grimm. But actually, in some ways, I think he's the English Homer. You know, Homer started a tradition, didn't he? And people kind of emulate him with more or less success. Everyone from Apollonius Rhodius to Virgil, the Aeneid. And I think that's what's happening with Tolkien.
So he did write mythology.
Let's probably not have this discussion now. We have one hopefully quick question here.
You pointed out about the moral certainty in Tolkien's work and moral uncertainty in Martin's work. I wanted to ask if you think this moral certainty could be explained by Tolkien's affinity and rigors to medieval texts.
Yeah, well, of course I do. This is what I've been mildly bellyaching about. Tolkien really was the English Grimm, in a way. He was the greatest of English philologists. Mind you, English philology was a rather stunted growth, far weaker than German philology, for instance. But Tolkien was certainly the major proponent of English philology. And as I've said many times, it was that philological understanding which was his major inspiration. He was trying to recreate a lot of it. Middle-earth was not his invention. He just put it together from scraps and bits and fragments and pieces. But every time he got stock, I think he went back to that tradition and used it again. And that was the way he worked. And that is another thing that no one has ever been able to reproduce, because they just don't know as much as he did. I'm going to use this line a bit later on, but it's such a good line, I think I'll use it twice. I think I have a collection of really stupid remarks about Tolkien. And I ask myself sometimes, which was the stupidest? Man, that's difficult, you know? But I think, arguably, the stupidest of them was made by one of my gurus when I was a suffering undergraduate at the University of Cambridge. And it was made by Raymond Williams. And he said, oh, Tolkien, he's half-educated. Pretty big half.